So I wanted you to think about this graph model again with the following question, which is, I mean, on Tuesday, I was explaining why that particular point X is the ideal situation for society if the policymaker is a good reflection of what society wants, assuming that in a democratic process, the policymaker conveys the preferences of people between the consumption of goods and services in the horizontal axis and the quality of the environment in the vertical axis. And within that orange region, having the feasible set, meaning all the possible combinations between these two dimensions. And with those dimensions, thinking that, of course, any situation, for example, around here where I am pointing, would be feasible, yes, but it wouldn't be totally efficient. Efficient in the sense that if I imagine, for example, this point, let's call this point Y. Moving from Y to X gives you more consumption of goods and services, so you can satisfy more needs of people. So imagine that going from Y to X means feeding more people, or giving shelter to more people, or giving jobs to more people, or giving energy to more people. But at the same time, going from Y to X means giving more environmental quality to people. So in general, moving from Y to X, it's a Pareto improvement in the sense that you get both good things we want in society, satisfying needs for people and at the same time improving their quality. Once in X, and this is the point, once you're in X, any movement along the frontier would mean sacrificing something in exchange for something else. So of course, if you move here to that point, let's call it Z, you don't give up from Y to Z, you don't give up in terms of environment, in terms of consumption, but yes, you improve in terms of quality of the environment. But moving from X to Z, you are giving up consumption in exchange for a little bit of environmental quality. Or moving from X to B, you give up environmental quality to improve the consumption of goods and services. Right? And finally, remember, any movement on the horizontal axis from right to left means the equivalent of abatement costs, because we are giving up on economic value from the consumption in exchange for gaining in environmental quality. And we did that last Tuesday. So again, I want to hear from one of you why B or Y or Z is inferior, is less desirable than X, if we assume these particular policymakers in different curves regarding the preferences of society between environment and consumption of goods and services, right? So let me just try here, and let me, Joseph, you raise your hand, Joseph Bandera. Do you want to answer? Go ahead.
Yeah, so X would be preferred because it's on the highest indifference curve and it's at the maximum feasible output.
Okay, so that's actually right on target. Maximum and feasible. That's very important. Those two words that Joseph used are key here, because at X you get the maximum, let's call it utility for the policymaker who is reflecting the desires of society, but at the same time it's still feasible. Because again, remember that if you are in this place, for example, here, that's nice that we get even more consumption and more environmental quality, but that point right there is unfeasible. So now let me ask anyone else how, and let me put that there as a, let's call this point Q. And let me ask any of you, how could we go from X to Q? Give me an idea to be able to move from X to Q. Max, go ahead.
Wouldn't technological advances go from X to Q?
Exactly. And now be even more specific. Give me a technological advance in these two dimensions, in either one of them, that will take us there.
Well, if it's for quality of environment, like I'm doing fracking right now, and a lot of people are talking about reducing pollution with fracking or ground instability.
So in that case, Max, it would mean improving the efficiency of fracking without harming the environment, being more surgical in how the findings in the ground where the gas or the oil is, so that you drill the wells more precisely without harming either geological stability or aquifers. That's one possibility, so that you can improve in that sense in one dimension without harming the other one. That's a possibility. Anyone else can think of technological innovations that can allow us to go from X to Q? If you think about your particular cases that you're studying, can you think of possibilities? So let me give you clues. If we go back, this is precisely that type of idea. If these are, and we were in fact talking about these particular different costs to abate environmental damages, right? Moving in this direction would mean improving technologically, so that at lower costs, we gain in reducing CO2 emissions. But even more so, these particular technologies that you see zoomed out in the left are even better ways to move us in terms of the frontier of possibilities between environmental quality and consumption of goods and services. So as you move in this direction, notice you are being capable of reducing emissions of CO2 at way lower costs. In fact, these are net positive abatement policies. Clear example, where you live in Massachusetts. You spend some money in your houses to, for example, insulate your home and change how architecturally in the house you refurnish windows, shieldings in the walls and the like, so that you can reduce the expenditure in your house in the gas bill for heating the house, throughout a good part of the year that in Massachusetts, you need to keep your house warm so that you spend less units of energy in terms of oil, fuel, or whatever you use for heating the house where your family lives. And therefore, you end up saving net in your own personal private costs, but at the same time, you are reducing the externalities to others. And that's that case that I am highlighting here. When you compare all these abatement costs, this particular case of changing something at the private level in terms of electronics, appliances, residential heating, different ways of doing strategies that save you money and at the same time reduces the emissions of CO2 to the atmosphere. That would be a case of exactly allowing us to move that frontier so that with the same money, you can achieve more quality of the environment and even eventually more consumption of goods and services. Because you're saving money in your electrical bill or your heating bill, and with that money, you can buy more food or you can improve something in the quality of your life. And that could mean that you can end up moving the frontier in a way that it can be, I'm just trying to draw there, a new frontier in which now it's optimal to be in Q. Okay? So that's part of the argument that I was trying to make there. To close up this point that I was making on Tuesday and move to the next step, what I want you to think is the following. Unfortunately, the slope of those blue lines that you see there, that slope not always reflects the preferences of society as a whole. Of course, we differ, right? But that line, those lines, the slope of those blue lines depend on the political economy of the situation, meaning that you can elect government officials in Congress and in the executive. And I am talking both at the federal level or at the state level or even at the county level, in which, depending on the political forces of who is capable of electing who, you can shift the slope of those blue lines upward or to flatter. And you live in a country, you're citizens of a country that definitely has seen this shift over and over since the 70s, since the energy crisis of the 1970s. During the times of Reagan and conservadorism, and then the times of Clinton and other governments more pro-environment or more pro-regulation, and other governments during Bush era towards deregulating. Then Obama, then Trump, and now back with Biden. All those cycles make precisely the slope of those blue lines go up and down. And you know how it works in the US, because also influence in Congress and election of Congress people, both at the state and national level, and it's no different in many parts of the world, respond to political forces of who can put money into the campaigns. And this is even within the law, including lobbying. So if lobbying is influenced by money and money is influenced by powerful groups, then you can get elected officials. You can get elections in the legislation and in the executive, and even in the judiciary too, shifting those preferences in those slopes. And that's the next point that I want to make here in terms of who gets those outcomes, how you end up in X or B, because B could be an optimal solution. Notice, using exactly the same argument, you could get, let's do this with this purple, you can get indifference curves that are of this kind that would make, I'm sorry, there, this is difficult to draw here, but I'm trying to make the following point. You can get indifference curves of this kind where B would be an optimal solution. And these purple lines reflect the policymakers' indifference curves that are going to favor increasing the consumption of goods and services, and they are going to sacrifice in terms of environmental quality. How much? Well, we can see there, we sacrifice all this in terms of environmental quality, and we gain all this in terms of consumption of goods and services. And depending on the arguments of the voters and all these political forces, some people may end up in a B situation, which would be, by the way, socially efficient if those forces end up shifting the slope of the indifference curves and therefore favoring this B solution instead of in terms of the X solution. Okay, so those situations in which people bargain over these possibilities is what I want to stress today in this discussion about policies. And for that, I ask you, so that I don't have to go over, to review those two pieces of information that I sent you, a news clip from Euronews and the other one from the New York Times on this particular story of this Italy, in the south of Italy, this village or this town called Taranto. So it's a heavy industry town, classical of what you have seen also in the US during the golden years of the auto industry, maybe in Michigan. The only difference today is that still today, this steel factory, the largest steel factory in Europe, is still debating and struggling with responding between exactly those points. And you heard about it, you read it, you saw the news. And I think it's a fascinating story because it's been going on for decades since this all started to worry people, with documented cases of cancer in children that increased by 21% according to serious rigorous studies. 21% increase in cancer for children under 14, directly related to emissions from this huge steel factory. And you can, if you want, go to Google Maps or Google Earth and zoom in until you find Taranto, and you can see how immense is the size of this factory and all that it is enclave of steel production. Okay, and similar to that, or as a good real world case, we can use the Brownsville case that it's in the textbook that you read in chapter 20, which is the following situation, which, by the way, is very similar to the Taranto case. A single business. So it's one company, like in Taranto, which is the Ili steel factory, which is the only provider of jobs in town, but it's also affecting the environment clearly for those around, being them employers or neighbors around, and their families, of course. Of course, for citizens, this is a complicated situation, like in the Taranto case, because they are getting both jobs, but the harm from the environmental externalities created by the factory. Business here, the company here, has power because it has the potential decision to increase or decrease wages, and on the other hand, increase or decrease environmental quality. Unfortunately, because of economic reasons, increasing wages means sacrificing profits, because of the increased costs, but also improving environmental quality implies sacrificing costs and therefore sacrificing profits. Workers here have also power, and citizens in general in this Brownsville town have power because eventually they can decide to leave. And if they leave, then the company needs to shut down, right? And that's the basic argument in this model. So what I'm going to present here in a little bit more rapid way, but I will stop if there are questions or doubts, from the model that we have in that chapter 20 is the following. And when you go to the digital version of the book, you can go step by step if this still seems confusing, but I hope you did that when you read that part of the chapter. So I'm going to put here in the vertical axis, again, environmental quality. In this case, it has to do with concentration of harmful particles in the air that, if aspired or in contact with the skin, can produce, for example, this cancer on humans in this town, okay? And that's going to be environmental quality in the vertical axis. And in the horizontal axis, I'm going to place wages. So we can assume with certain tranquility that the citizens of Brownsville are interested in getting more environmental quality, but they also enjoy more wages. I mean, it's difficult to contest that, right? It would be nice to get better wages and better environmental quality, but we don't know how far that can go in both axes, right? And those citizens will have, again, using the same tool from economics, an indifference curve between environmental quality and wages. In other words, and you can survey people on this, how much are you willing to sacrifice in wages to get a better environment? And this is not hard to think as feasible. So if you live in a heavily polluted area, earning a good wage, and you are offered a job that eventually pays less, but you move to a place that you don't put your risks in harm's way, your kids in harm's way, you may eventually value the life of your children and say, I'm willing to take that job which gives me less earnings to spend, but I am moving to a place where I am sure that my children are not exposed to these levels of pollution that create cancer to my kids. And that is represented here with that indifference curve that you see here, meaning, again, that if I move in this direction, is because I am willing to sacrifice in environmental quality to improve my wages, which is one possibility. Or moving in this direction and sacrificing wages and increasing environmental quality, which is what I just said. Imagine the following. This particular case would be kids in K-12 education. And notice why I am making that case. K-12 public education is quite cheap in the US, almost free in many ways, because it's subsidized by the government, by the taxpayers. And therefore, you can sacrifice in that job to get less money, but improve the quality of life so that your children during school time are not exposed to these cancerous emissions in the air. But this, I'm going to put it as kids in college. And you can see now the problem. College is expensive, and therefore you would be interested in moving from here to here because you are willing to sacrifice part of the environmental quality you're getting because your kids are now moving to college and you need those higher wages to pay for the college education that you want for your kids. Notice this is the same person, just balancing everything that is together as a bundle of environmental quality, wages, income, and household expenditures, so that you try to give the best possible to your kids. Okay? That's that indifference curve that we're seeing there. Okay? Now, let me erase that now. And let me go back to the next step in the graph, which is the red sloped line that you see there. This is slope line. And this is going to be what we can call the ISO cost for the firm, for this company in Brownsville. Because this company can improve environmental quality by putting some filters into its production process. But it needs to spend money to put those filters so that the emissions are lower and less harmful to people. That costs money. And that cost is going to go against wages. Or this company can increase wages, but it's going to be at the cost of not spending in environmental abatement of the harmful emissions that this company has. Okay? And that's going to be reflected in that red line. So you can have a situation in this area, which is the company is spending more and more in environmental control, in reducing the damages from its production. That's what we call abatement measures. But it's going to be sacrificing in wages and lowering the wages. Or it can go around these places, meaning it's going to pay more wages so that these workers stay and work for them and encourage the workers to work productively, but it's going to sacrifice in environmental quality. With those two dimensions from the standpoint of the citizens who have trade-offs between environmental quality and wages, and the company who also has trade-offs between spending on environmental quality and spending on wages, we are going to look at the negotiation between these parties and how they can move from one situation to another one, and particularly how much space for mutually beneficial bargaining there is according to what we're seeing there. Remembering, and that's the final point in this first step of the analysis, that anything here in this green area, this shaded green area, means, so imagine this particular point here, and let's call that, let's see, I don't want to mess up with the other letters, X. X or Y are so low in terms of wages or so low in terms of environmental quality that they are not that interesting for the citizens, and they might as well move and go to another town, another state, another region, away from Brownsville, because the wages are bad and the environmental quality is bad. And therefore, if you're thinking about your kids, either because they are in college or in K-12, you find it unfeasible for you to get a job so badly paid and additional to that with such a bad environmental quality. So you just leave. In X or Y, you leave. But once you improve from X or Y towards this particular indifference curve, so if you move here, or you move here, or you move here, or you move here, or here, or here, you end up, and that's what it says here, in the reservation indifference curve for the citizens. Meaning, once in those points in that particular line, you stay. Either you stay here, for example, because the environmental quality is so good, even if the wages are that bad, or you stay here because the pay is good, even though the environmental quality is bad. But once you move from that reservation indifference curve towards any of those points in the green area, you decide to leave town. And the point is that the company knows that. And the company knows that the citizens have indifference curves, and therefore they have trade-offs to make between environmental quality and their wages. On the other hand, and now I want you to think, I'm going to put that in maybe in red. Imagine this point here. I'm going to call it P, or this point here, Q. P or Q would be great for those citizens. Imagine P. It means much more environmental quality and way better wages. This is like the ideal job in Maine or New Hampshire, in the middle of clean air, forested areas, parks, no pollution, clean water, all that kind of stuff. Q would be a little bit less of that environmental quality, but even better wages. But the problem is that in either P or Q, the company's costs are impossible, because the company would have to pay a lot in wages and a lot in environmental protection, that it would be unfeasible and the company will go broke. So all that area here, all this area too, is unfeasible for the company because it's too costly. And this area is unfeasible for the citizens because it's unviable in terms of quality of life. So let me erase all that stuff and come back to the basics. Within that, we are going to have an area, and notice the point, all this area here, which would be the space for environmental bargaining between the company and the citizens. Any movement towards any of that sort of lens area that I just highlighted would mean that it is feasible for the company in terms of costs, and it's also feasible or likable for the citizens, because it would mean a little bit of improvement in either wages or environmental quality, or both, for the citizens, but also it would mean that it is feasible in terms of costs for the company. The company would love this situation here because it's cheap, dirt cheap for the company to be in that particular point that I just marked, because it's pay low wages and do almost nothing about the environment. But the citizens are not going to accept that. Okay, so that's where we're going to go now. So several steps there, you end up in this type of graph or analysis. And again, you can go back to the text, but I think you have seen my logic of thought to build this here. So if those are the indifference curves, bless you, Joseph. If those are indifference, see why it's so cool to see you in the cameras? Because I can empathize with you. Actually, it's envy. Every time somebody sneezes, to me, it's envy because I love to sneeze. So it's this brain pleasure to get a sneeze. Anyway, yeah, I love to sneeze. I think it's healthy. And if you scream, it's cool. B here, this point B, notice, would be a point in which citizens optimize their preferences, because we are taking these indifference curves curve all the way the farthest possible to the upper right, which means better for the citizens in B, but for the company is going to be the most expensive one, right? Because it means for the company that in Emax, the company is spending the most in terms of environmental protection, filters, treatment plants, you name it. And also is paying those wages W asterisk there. The company would like to move to C. The citizens wouldn't like that a lot. Notice, if I move from B to C, the citizens are seeing the same wages. So in that sense, for the company, it's the same cost to move from B to C. But the company is saving on environmental preservation, on environmental control of its emissions. Even further, move to A. A is even better for the company because now the company is still saving, is still paying the same wages, but it's saving on environmental control, on abatement costs. So if you move from B to C to A, the company wins because the company increases profits by reducing its costs and particularly its private abatement costs. For the citizens, moving from B to A, it's a loss. And it is a loss because they lost on environmental quality even though they have the same wages. But still in A, the citizens are still willing to stay in town and work for the company. They would prefer to be in C, and even better, they would prefer to be in B. But the company needs to spend money to move from A to C to B, because it will have to invest in abatement technologies to improve the environmental quality. And if you remember the story of Taranto in Italy, that is one of the major issues in this permanent debate between the citizens of Taranto and the company on how much is the company willing to spend money in reducing the emissions, in cleaning up their mess, but it's going to go out of pocket somehow. And then it could hurt either the number of jobs that they offer to the Taranto citizens or the wages that they pay to their current workers. So the citizens have mobilized, and you saw the testimonies of all these families and even generations after generations of people who have worked for this company for decades, concerned about the emissions from the steel factory. But at some point, the debate between shutting down the plant and killing all those jobs for the sake of the environment is a costly decision, but it's also a costly decision to continue business as usual, to maintain those workers, those jobs, but at the same time creating the harm that it's well documented on the health of the citizens. So if we think about changing the environmental quality between A and B, maintaining wages fixed is going to be a matter of bargaining between the parties. And again, this is going to be the result of that bargaining is going to be depend on the political power that one or the other one has when they sit at the table at defining whether the company shuts down or whether the people leave town and they don't work anymore for the company, right? So it's a complicated issue, and it's going to depend again on who has power when they sit at the table. You could you can go back and think about the quotient bargaining, but that's going to be complicated. So imagine the citizens offering money to the company in exchange for the company to clean up their mess in the factory, or you can think of the company offering money to the citizens in exchange for putting up with the pollution and letting them continue the steel production because there is demand for steel in the world. And again, depending on the political power of one or the other one, that bargaining situation will shift things away towards B or away towards A. And it gets interesting in the sense that we know that anything above point B simply is not going to be feasible for the plant, for the company, and then the company will threaten to shut down, which has happened in the Taranto case, by the way, if you collect the whole story. But also anything going below A will mean that people leave. And by leave, meaning they don't work anymore for the company. Now, the context in which we're talking about right now could be more complex if we think of, for example, the possibility that the threat for the company that the citizens are going to leave is not a credible threat. Why could be not a credible threat? Because people could threat to leave and the company knows that there will be other families in other parts of the world who would be willing to move to Taranto and work for the company. I mean, we're talking about the south of Italy, one of the incoming places of migrants from Africa who are running away from North Africa, Eastern Europe, and the like, who are running away from Syria, from Morocco, from Egypt, from lots of places from North Africa, from dire conditions, who eventually would come to Taranto and say, I would be willing to work here. Hey, but that's highly polluted and they pay bad wages. I don't mind. This is still better than my hometown. And that can complicate the issue here. Because that could mean that the minimum indifference curve that we are talking about as the reservation indifference curve could shift inward and then create a new scenario for bargaining for the company, who would say, let them leave if they want. There will be these migrants coming in who are willing to take those jobs at such bad conditions in terms of environmental quality and such bad wage conditions, because anyway, it's better than their origin place. And that's why they are migrating, right? Also, on the other extreme, the company could claim that they have a threat, a credible threat of shutting down, but it could be the case that that's not a credible threat in the sense that the company could be bailed out by the government. And therefore, you can improve the bargaining power on the side of the citizens by knowing, or if they have the legislature on their side, by knowing that the government and the legislator would approve a bailout of those companies so that they don't shut down. And remember the bailout of the big auto companies during the 2008 crash and the 2011 crash. It was a huge bailout for the auto companies. So the bargaining power of the parties here is going to change depending on many, many things. And I just want you to be aware that this is part of, again, this that I'm saying, the political economy of these different situations. And this is one more way on how we can model the environmental issues with the economic issues within one compact, in this case, graph that allows us to analyze all these things. I'm pretty sure that you could think of your particular case that you're studying and you're working on, in which you could incorporate this one more model of analysis to be able to study what are the bargaining positions, or of, for example, if this involves a particular power plant, an energy production plant, if this involves a particular farm, if this involves a particular business that creates harms and needs to employ people, and those people employed live nearby or are affected by the externalities from this particular business, how this analysis could be done based on this. Okay. Okay. Let me stop for a second there. Let me see how we're doing with time. We still have some 20 more minutes. Is there any question on this, or is this clear at this point of what I'm trying to argue, to use this model to explain the problem of bargaining and political power between different parties in this case? No, are there questions about this model, or it is more or less clear? Okay. So I'm going to assume that silence as this has been clear. Finally, one more step in the analysis of defining environmental policies and the analysis of the political economy of environmental regulation and possibilities and trade-offs between a good environment and a good economy. I wanted to highlight this particular case of the cap and trade mechanism because I think it's an interesting yet controversial case for how market instruments and market-based policies have been trying to create way into the policy-making discussion around the world. And I think this is interesting in itself. And again, it's controversial. It has ethical issues involved too. And it's one more policy instrument that you should be aware because it's actually ongoing. And in some cases, it seems to be successful. And in other cases, it doesn't seem to be as successful. But before I describe it in more detail, and I hope you read that part in the text, let me go back to other cases in which we have discussed mechanisms that may solve environmental problems that seem to be creative as thought experiments, but at the same time involve ethical issues that we should always maintain in our minds. So if you remember the cost bargaining between the victim and the polluter, and the fact that both could be interested in negotiating getting to the optimal level of pollution, which we already described a long time ago, and providing the possibility that these two parties could end up in a situation that is mutually beneficial using the threats from both sides. It has ethical issues involved, like the following. What if one of the bargaining powers can impose the solution to the other one because that one has much more political or legal or financial capacity to push the solution towards its own benefit and against the other one, and still be within the so-called Pareto improvement area? Secondly, it's controversial ethically because it's based on the idea that you can bribe the other one, that you know the situation of the other party and you bribe by offering money so that the other person puts up with whatever it is that this other person doesn't like. And that's ethically controversial too, even though we have demonstrated that in terms of economic efficiency, it makes some sense because it's mutually beneficial for the two parties through the quotient bargaining, get to a point in which both parties gain something. But still, I like to pose this as examples of how we get an economic criteria to analyze possible avenues to solve environmental problems and then be able to understand how this works, and with that in mind, evaluate the ethical consequences and not only the economic efficiency consequences. So that's one more example that we have been discussing in the past. Max, you have a question, go ahead.
Yes, do you want us to discuss cap and trade mechanisms in our paper?
If you want, and I'm going to explain it in a second. And in fact, a couple of you have already mentioned, if you want to discuss it, you can go ahead and discuss it. But to me, the important part is that regardless of whether it applies to your case or not, is that you are aware of this type of mechanisms that are out there. So let me describe it and with that and how the model works. And you can judge for yourself if you think this is something useful to add to the analysis that you're making, because it makes a lot of sense in many domains. And again, once again, it involves ethical issues that we should always be aware of. So basically how cap and trade work is the following. The first step is that the government decides which is the level of maximum environmental degradation it wants, right? So the government needs to set a goal. That goal could be the total tons of CO2 emitted per year in a particular place. And that cap could be the stock of fish that you want in the lake there at a steady state situation. That cap could be the concentration of metals, heavy metals in the water, in a water stream or in a lake. So once the government decides that total level, maximum level of degradation, then the government decides how much abatement is needed from the current situation all the way down to that level that is desired, which doesn't necessarily means zero pollution, because again, zero pollution could imply many things. It could imply loss of jobs, shutting down the economy, and so on. But there's probably a level of pollution that is acceptable for the World Health Organization, that is acceptable for biodiversity standards, that is acceptable for whatever environmental quality you want. And you want to move from the current situation all the way down to that level of abatement, or with abatement to that level of maximum degradation that you want to achieve. So the government sets that, and with that, the government then issues permits. So it issues a total number of permits that is going to distribute among everybody that is interested in the economic activity that produces this problem. And with that, with those permits issued, then the government is going to allocate these permits. And the way the government allocates these permits is either through an auction or by assigning them to everyone in equal shares or proportional to production. There are many criteria to assign the permits to the polluters. Once these polluters have those permits in their hands, they can either use them or sell them for money. And that's where the trick comes. The trick comes with the government, after issuing these permits, observes and monitors who is interested in trading with who for a permit. So the intuition here from economics is that if you are a polluter that can improve with technology your production process, you may not have to use your permits, because you are going to emit way less below the number of permits that you have in your house, and therefore you are going to sell that permit to someone who is interested in polluting. So imagine large cities in the US, and in the street where you live, and your place where you live, the apartment, doesn't have parking spaces. So you have to park in the street. And the street has a limited number of permits, a limited number of spaces for parking. So you can have 20 neighbors and 15 of them have a car, at least one car, and maybe a couple of them have 2 cars in the household. And the street has only space for 10 cars. And imagine that you are one of those neighbors who doesn't own a car because you have a bicycle and you don't use a car, but you have a permit because it was assigned to you by the city. I'm pretty sure that if you post that in the light post or the bulletin board of the neighborhood or the mailing list or whatever, Craigslist, you name it, you can sell that permit for money, because we know we have an excess demand, because there are people even with 2 cars and there are no enough spaces in the street, because we're talking about only 10 spaces, 20 neighbors, and 15 of them with cars. So you can sell your permit and make some money. But also, if you own those 2 cars and you only have 1 permit, you will be willing to buy that extra permit that you have, because it's in your own interest to buy that permit, and therefore you can park your 2 cars in the street. But still, we have 15 cars and only 10 spaces. So the number is going to go up in the price in the market for those parking spaces. And at some point, we're going to find an equilibrium price in which the permit, the parking permit in the street, is going to reach a price, and everyone holding a permit will go and evaluate, is it worth have a car here parked and foregoing that money? Or is it worth getting rid of my car and selling the permit? Or things like, well, I would be interested in parking 5 blocks away from here in a very cheap space or even free space, sell my permit and make some money. That's the philosophy of the cap and trade mechanism with pollution. Okay, so once that happens and the permits are traded, then each polluter is going to submit to the government the permits for emissions, and then the government is going to go back to those companies and evaluate to make sure that each company emits only up to the point in which they are allowed to emit. And again, it comes with the incentives that I just mentioned. Maybe a neighbor would be interested in selling his car and now start moving by bicycle and get some money from the parking permit that that person holds. But another neighbor may not value that because it wants to hold the permit, because still that person needs to park right in front of the house in the street, because that person drives every day to work to a place where public transportation is not operable. So each case is going to decide between its own private benefits and costs, and they're going to trade these permits. So the same for the companies. So with that in mind, the model works more or less the following way. So again, in a graphical diagram, I am going to show you here how is this model work. And basically the idea is that in the horizontal axis, let's say the width of that box, that green line from extreme to extreme, is the measurement of the total amount of abatement that is required, and therefore that will guide the number of permits that are going to be issued. And in the vertical axis, in both sides, we are going to have the abatement costs for each of the companies that are eventually going to trade with each other. So in this simplified world, there are only two companies polluting, firm A and firm B. They know that they have only this amount of possible levels of abatement or emissions. And they are going to be assigned a number of permits. But there's a catch. So it happens that this company A, if I graph its own marginal per capita abatement cost, the marginal cost of abating, meaning that the more it needs to emit, the more costly is to abate, to reduce that externality. It's a flatter curve because firm A seems to be more efficient, meaning that for a particular level of abatement, the height from here to here is lower than what it is for company B, which is an old technology, highly polluting firm. Here, you have to be careful that you need to read the curve for firm B in blue from here to here, the other way around, from right to left. But the reason for doing that is that we want to put both firms together in the same model. And in that case, in the same diagram, let's imagine that the government decides that given this level of abatement required, and therefore the number of permits, the government goes to firm A and B and says, I am going to assign you half and half the permits that I have. And then you go ahead and trade among yourselves. If I do that as government, that initial allocation of permits is this vertical line here, which is dividing exactly halfway the level of abatement. And it happens that because firm A is more efficient, firm A is going to be willing to sell permits to firm B. And B, because it has a steeper curve for its costs for abating pollution, meaning it's costlier for firm B to reduce pollution, firm B is interested in getting permits from A, because A is going to be needing less permits to use, and B is going to need more permits to use. And apparently, that might sound like a zero-sum game in the sense that, what's the point? If one company pollutes less, but the other one is going to pollute more? No, there are costs saved here. Because company A is going to release those permits, but is going to gain back some money that is good for the business for firm A, and therefore there are incentives for firm A in red to continue being a cleaner technology and maybe investing more in getting that red line flatter. The flatter that red line gets, the more money company A earns by selling the permits that is not using because it doesn't need to, because it has a cleaner technology. But also firm B is paying extra cash to firm A to buy those permits, and eventually firm B is going to evaluate if it is costlier to buy permits or to renovate the technology and improve the technology to get that blue line flatter too. So there are both incentives to trade between them because there's going to be earnings for one of them, net earnings. And on the other hand, there's going to be incentives for improving the technology to get a cleaner production process in both cases. And the net gains are precisely this green triangle right there. That's the net gain from society by letting these two firms trade, so that firm A in red sells the permits to firm B, and firm B buys those permits, and still society gains by achieving the total goal, which is the width of the box, because we are achieving that goal, but we are achieving that goal by getting A to sell permits to B pays for that, A earns some money, and net we achieve the goal. And that's the philosophy of the cap and trade model. And in theory, it makes a lot of economic sense. In practice, there's evidence in many directions. So there are cap and trade markets right now working for some major pollutants, for CO2, for NO2, for SO2, different types of pollutants. I'm just going to show you for carbon prices in the European Union right now. And if you link down there in that link, which is a monitor of the current prices, let's see if I can do that in my last 2 minutes. But actually, you can do it on yourself and you can watch what happens. These are the prices that have been evolving from somewhere around $40 per ton of carbon, and the prices kept going down and down up until 2013. And at that point, people were very skeptical of the cap and trade market. Then between 2013 and on, there seems to be a little bit of improvement. And if you look at the prices up until 2000, at 2000 more or less, in fact, between 2013 and 15 and over, which is what you can see from 13 and over, not only this improvement, but this big hike. But then it began to go down again in the prices in the European Union. So I'm going to create curiosity with you to go to that link later on and check how the prices are right now. But at this point, at the end of the century, they were somewhere around between $22, $23 per ton. But remember, these prices are a reflection of how much interest there is in technological innovation, but also in buying permits or in selling permits, right? If there is interest in buying permits, it's because there are interest in polluting firms to buy them, and that's a signal of what is happening in the market. But also, one more trick to close on this particular case, which is the following. Interest groups, imagine environmental organizations, could pull together lots of money and buy those permits and put them out of the market. Right? So imagine conservation groups saying, we're going to go out there and buy permits and we don't sell them to any polluting firm. So there are less permits circulating in the air. No pun intended. And therefore, the permits that are in the market are fewer, and there has to be more competition among polluter firms to buy them. And if they get too expensive, then it might be an incentive to innovate in their technologies to get cleaner technologies instead of buying very expensive permits. Okay, so I am going to stop with that with cap and trade, and let me steal 1 minute with you. And once you finish this quick experiment, I will work with this next week on Tuesday. But let me ask you this particular situation, which is our last piece, which is the problem of intergenerational equity and sustainability. So you can answer that, and once you're done, you can leave, and we're done with that. So thank you for answering those quick questions. And again, when you're finished, you can leave.
Can we assume that the inflation will be below 5%? I'm sorry, I gave it away. I gave it away. I'm sorry.
Imagine current inflation. Inflation is not that high in the US, and it's not going to be. Imagine your current inflation.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you.
I mean, it's not going to go that high. Yeah.
Yeah. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Hello, Professor.
Yes.
This is Jesse. I have missed a couple classes. I was out of state,
Yeah.
and I just want to check and see what I could do to like catch up and what I've missed.
Yeah. First of all, complete the answers to the poll. I think everybody and okay. Yeah, I mean, catch up by watching the videos of the previous classes. They are all posted. Catch up with the plan for the week that I have been posting in Moodle, and catch up with the readings and the discussions that I have done in the classes, in the videos. And you missed the quiz, but we're going to have chances for more quizzes. But that should be your best plan. I would highly recommend go to the videos.
Am I gonna get a 0 on the quiz? Because I
Yeah.
emailed you before I left.
Yeah. But again, I'm going to have more quizzes so that you can that doesn't have a big weight on your weight.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. How much each quiz count as?
I wouldn't put a number right now because I want to do a couple more of them so that you don't depend on only one or two like what we have today. The total for quizzes, I don't remember what it is, but I can look it up right now. Give me a second. I have it here in the syllabus, and let me show you here. And you can go to this too. But what we have here in terms of grades is that we have for quizzes 10% for everything with polling and quizzes online. Okay.
Okay.
So we have had 2 so far, and I hope we get a couple more in this other half of the course.
Okay. And have we done any written essays besides the first one?
There's one due tomorrow.
Oh.
Yeah, and I have been talking a lot about this in the last 4 classes, a lot. And I held office hours to help with the.
Yeah, I was 6 hours behind, so I wasn't able to make any of.
Yeah. No. I had office hours twice this week to help you guys with that essay, which is again due tomorrow. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Bye. Hi, Eric. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to let you know that on that